Every weak resident of this city has been given a pet superhero, but they've used their powers in the wrong way. Now it's up to a young comic book reader to put an end to these trainers' chaotic battles. Today we're going to recap the first season of the series, Hero Inside, from 2024. In the morning, during a heavy fog, a driver ends up being hit by a superhero who has been thrown onto the car during a battle. After causing an accident, the man gets up with difficulty, but is once again attacked by his opponent, who tries to eliminate him with a fatal blow. However, seconds before hitting his head on the asphalt, Gravity uses his zero-gravity trick to get rid of the attack. Just as he was about to lose the fight, the big man manages to fight back and uses his giant hand to punch Gravity, which forms a large crater when it hits the ground. After the battle, a masked young woman known as X appears on the scene and takes 2 new comic books for her collection. A few days later, Mike goes to a comic book store to buy the new edition of his favorite story and ends up getting a comic book of The Crying Man as a gift. While walking along the sidewalk, the young man takes the opportunity to read the story and ends up bumping into Lucy, the prettiest girl in his school. When he finds out that the young woman is on her way to a party, Mike tries to convince his mother to let him go and uses a gift as a bribe to convince her. It's only 30 minutes before the party at Diego's house begins when Mike manages to finish reading his new comic book and suddenly something strange happens. As if by magic, the crying man comes out of the comic book and ends up in the bathroom of the young man's house. After a crying fit, the superhero finally manages to calm down and reveals that Mike has called him into his world. At that moment, Crying Man steps on one of the action figures in the young man's collection and, on seeing the broken toy, he starts to cry. His tears flood Mike's room and destroy everything around him, leaving the young man furious. He immediately orders the hero to return to the comic and suddenly the body of the crying man is sucked back in. A few minutes later, Mike finds his friend and reveals that the comic book is magic, but Nick doesn't believe it. To prove he's telling the truth, Mike tries to summon the crying man, but this time nothing happens. However, when Nick walks away, the superhero appears and even saves the young man who was about to be hit by a truck. After preventing Nick from being crushed, the crying man picks up the young men and sets off on his next rescue mission. That night, the Black Knight breaks into a house to steal a superhero comic and accidentally starts a fire. On arriving at the scene, Mike and the crying man discover that there is a child trapped in the flames and decide to go in to rescue him. The girl was terrified and was almost crushed when the roof began to collapse, but luckily the Black Knight heard her cries for help and managed to save her. However, after meeting Beck, the superhero realizes that there is no way out and his cries for help are heard by the crying man. With his jet of tears, the hero makes his way into the room and, thanks to him, the pair who were surrounded by fire managed to escape. However, it's the Black Knight who gets all the credit for saving the child, as he managed to get Beck out of the burning house with Crying Man's help. Then the superhero ends up being pulled back inside and puts Mike's and Crying's lives at risk. While hanging on the brink of elimination, the young man asks the crying man to use the tsunami of tears to save them and manages to put out the fire in the whole house. After using all his power, the superhero is exhausted and returns to the comic while Mike is saved by the Black Knight. After landing safely, the superhero disappears and returns to the current owner of his comic. The truth is that it was a nerd called Dirk who ordered him to break into that house to steal the Mummy Girl comic book for his collection. The next morning, Nick decides to pay his friend a visit and they both decide to test the crying man's abilities to find out how best to harness them. During the tests, they discovered that the sadder he is, the stronger the superhero becomes. As Crying Man uses his superpowers, Mike also becomes exhausted, as his mind is strongly linked to him. So the trio decide to stop for a rest and the young men ask about Scott, the creator of that comic. According to Crying Man, that guy created a lot of different superhero comics, so Nick has the idea of buying them all. The problem is that he's not the only one with this plan, as Dirk is already devising a strategy to steal the Crying Man comic book. That afternoon, a giant poodle called Lucky attacks the residents of a San Francisco neighborhood on the orders of his master. The woman intends to use the animal to take revenge on her neighbors, but her plans are interrupted by Gravity and the masked girl. After deactivating the zero-gravity bubble, the superhero ends up being attacked by the dog and, to stop the battle, the young woman tries to steal Lucky's comic. Just then, she is attacked by the old lady and the comic book is thrown away. While this battle is going on in the south of the city, Nick is trying to convince his friend to wear a superhero uniform to accompany Crying Man on his missions. This way, Mike will be able to hide his identity and Nick will be able to film all the action scenes to post on his channel. However, when he realizes that Nick only wants to take advantage of the situation, Mike orders him to leave and, on the way home, the the young man receives a message from Dirk. After picking up the comic, Lucky manages to hand it over to his master and, with the comic in hand, the woman turns him into an even bigger dog. To counter this blow, X activates a gravity surprise attack and the hero manages to win the battle. After being defeated, Lucky returns to the comic and the young masked woman gets another comic for her collection. Minutes later, Nick arrives at Dirk's house and the man invites him into the basement. Realizing that this guy is dangerous, the young man decides to leave, but is captured by Mummy Girl, who drags him into the basement. The nerd's plan is to use Nick as a prisoner to convince Mike to hand over his Crying Man comic, but the young man refuses to reveal the identity of his best friend. While Nick is being attacked by Dirk and his entities, Mike goes to a diner and, on seeing a group of young people having fun together, he begins to think about apologizing to his friend. That night, Dirk posts a new video on Nick's channel and, through it, Mike discovers that the young man has been captured. Determined to save him, the young man takes the Crying Man comic and puts on his uniform to go to the man's house. After being greeted by Dirk's mother, Mike breaks into the basement and orders him to free his friend, but Dirk sends Mummy Girl to attack him. At that moment, the young man summons the Crying Man into battle and, while the two entities clash, Mike helps his friend escape. However, Dirk grabs his lightsaber to stop them, so Mike decides to make a strategic move. Seeing a shelf full of action figures, the young man chooses the most valuable action figure in the collection to throw far away. Immediately, Dirk abandons his lightsaber and runs to get the toy, but when his mother appears with a piece of lemon pie, the man gets scared and ends up dropping the action figure on the floor. Furious, he starts shouting at his mother, who gets hurt and leaves. Seeing this scene, the Crying Man is overcome with deep sadness and his tsunami of tears floods the whole house. After this bout of crying, the superhero feels exhausted and returns to his comic, whereupon Mike finds the Black Knight's comic and calls him to battle. When faced with her new opponent, Mummy Girl manages to immobilize him with her bandages, but the Black Knight uses his vocalization to call a flock of birds to attack his opponent. After being defeated, the mummy returns to her comic and Nick helps his friend return home. Hours later, when he wakes up, Dirk realizes that the young men have taken his comics and goes after Sparkule's comic, as he intends to use it as a trump card to get his superheroes back. That night, after stealing money from a young man walking alone in the street, George ends up becoming the victim of a masked vigilante and a video of him dancing goes viral on the internet. The next day, when he goes to school, the delinquent becomes the laughing stock of all his classmates because he still can't stop dancing. A few minutes later, Ed shows up and is late for class. Seeing the young man walking through the corridors, Diego knocks him down and Mike quickly helps him up. In doing so, he also ends up being targeted by the bully, but Lucy stops the fight and orders Diego to leave the young man alone. After being kicked out of his house, Dirk wanders aimlessly through the streets and ends up getting into a fight with a couple of tough guys. When he was about to be beaten, he decided to ask for help and called Sparkules to defend him. However, by summoning lightning to attack his enemies, the superhero causes a short circuit and knocks out all the electricity in the city. When the lights go out, the vigilante shows up to teach Diego a lesson and invokes his dancing entities to attack him. During the battle, when Diego is already unconscious, Mike and Crying Man show up to interrupt the fight, but end up becoming Disco Duo's new targets. After being hit by the lights of the mirrored globe, the Crying Man starts dancing and Mike has to call him back into the comic. Mike then summons the Black Knight to battle, but the superhero looks for a place to hide, as light is his greatest weakness. When his heroes are weakened, Ed decides to hit Diego on his own with a chair, but Mike uses his own body as a shield to block the attack. At that moment, Ed realizes that his identity has been discovered thanks to the star he puts on the notes he sends to his victims. In an attempt to calm the young man down, Mike removes his mask and Ed feels confused. After all, he was once Diego's victim too. Then Mike reminds the young man that the role of a superhero is to protect people and Ed realizes that he was acting like a villain. After calling Disco Duo back, the young man gives his comic to Mike, as he believes he will make better use of it. Meanwhile, Dirk keeps trying to escape the bullies and ends up being saved by a mysterious woman. Over the next few weeks, more and more heroes spread across the city of San Francisco and their comic books end up in the hands of all kinds of people. While Harry uses the Hummingbird Man's powers to steal the belongings of locals walking the streets, an elderly woman calls on Mr. Justice to help her tend to her vegetable garden. The superhero is planting some seeds when a group of raccoons invade the yard and Mr. Justice ends up being attacked by them. Despite taking several blows and not fighting back, the hero manages to overcome his enemies through exhaustion and the raccoons give up the invasion. Meanwhile, Tim, a preteen young man, breaks into a gang's hideout and summons the Jelly King to attack the gamer who defeated him in the last match because he cheated during the game. On the other side of town, a psychologist enlists the help of Professor Z to delve into his patient's mind and help her make peace with her perished father, as the woman harbors deep resentment towards him. After being saved by Krista, Dirk is taken to meet Scott who, after showing all his strength, gives the man several comic books. When he finds out about several thefts that have been taking place in downtown San Francisco, Nick enlists Mike's help to investigate. As the pair search for clues, a watch falls on Mike's head and he soon finds the person responsible for the robberies. However, before the two friends can act, the masked girl and Great Finger appear and start a chase. Seeing them, Harry tries to run away and Great Finger uses his almighty finger to attack them, but Hummingbird Man manages to dodge the attack. When she realizes how much damage her superhero has done to the city, X decides to change her strategy and calls Lucky to chase the villains. At this point, Mike springs into action and orders Crying Man to attack the fugitives, but the girl rejects his help as she is determined to keep the Hummingbird Man comic book. As a result, she sees the superhero duo as a threat and orders Lucky to attack them. Confused, Mike tries to understand what's going on. For him, they're both on the same team, because the ultimate goal is to catch the thief. Seeing a derailed train coming down the asphalt, Mike runs to warn people and manages to save an old lady who was trapped inside her car. Thanks to him, no one was hurt, but in order to avoid any injuries, the vehicle will have to be stopped. To help him on this mission, Mike calls in Mummy Girl, who uses her bandages to create a safety net. With her powers, she prevents the wagon from falling into the ocean and saves the lives of dozens of people who were trapped inside. After this heroic act, Mike is completely exhausted and falls into the ocean off the wagon. When he wakes up, the young man realizes that he has been rescued and is alive at home, but his Crying Man comic has disappeared. The next morning, during history class, the professor sets out the pairs for the next project that the students will have to hand in, and Mike is extremely happy when he finds out that he will be working with Lucy. However, before starting the project, they decide to take a break to eat and Mike takes his classmate to visit his favorite diner. The pair then stop off at a comic book store and suddenly a strange guy enters. According to the saleswoman, he turns up every day looking for some magical superhero comic and, on this day, his wish finally comes true. During the search, he finds Sylph's comic book and frees the fairy. Then they both leave the store and Mike and Lucy immediately go after him. It's not long before the man starts using Sylph's superpowers to hurt people and, at his command, the fairy destroys an entire building. While testing her new friend's skills, the man orders her to activate the Supreme Tornado and everything around her begins to be swept into the hurricane. Seeing Mike being carried away, Lucy takes a risk to try and save him and they are both sucked into the cyclone. When he realizes that he won't be able to escape this situation, the young man decides to ask Mummy Girl for help and the heroine manages to save them with her bandages. However, after leaving Lucy safely, Mike decides to go after Sylph's comic, because he knows that this is the only way to stop that tornado. After taking the comic book, the young man orders the fairy to return and immediately the cyclone is undone. With the help of Mummy Girl, the two youngsters manage to return safely to the ground and Lucy promises that she will keep Mike's secret. After the latest events that have brought real chaos to the city of San Francisco, Mike's mother, who is a journalist, begins to suspect that supernatural entities are behind these phenomena. However, when she decides to talk to her boss about it, Tara realizes that he is not interested in financing her investigation and has to convince Jerry that this story will bring great popularity to the newspaper. That afternoon, when he returns home, Mike receives a visit from X, who is there to steal his comics. However, the young man refuses to hand over the comics, so the vigilante calls the Crying Man to attack him. Even against his will, the superhero is forced to follow his master's orders and goes after Mike. In an attempt to escape, the young man jumps out of the window and summons Mummy Girl to save him. Then they both go out onto the terrace and are followed by the young girl. When he realizes that the Crying Man will be no match for them, X calls Gravity to join the battle and Mike decides to run away. Theoretically, no one can summon two heroes at once, but the masked girl proves this theory wrong. During the battle against the two superheroes, Mummy Girl is defeated and Mike summons the Black Knight to help him. As he doesn't want to hurt his old friend, the young man decides to run away, but the vigilante orders Crying Man to go after them and the pair end up being defeated. Furious, the young man decides to call Sylph to put an end to his enemy and causes another tornado. However, the vigilante fights back and uses Great Finger's almighty punch to end the hurricane. Seeing Mike weakened, X sends Lucky to steal his backpack, but his opponent manages to surprise her with an unexpected maneuver. When the battle seemed to be lost, the young man called the Crying Man to help him, as he had managed to recover the comic book during the tornado. With the help of his favorite superhero, Mike sends his adversaries away and discovers the true identity of the masked vigilante. While Lucy is still unconscious, the young man picks up the comics and leaves, because he hasn't yet realized that the girl he likes is his archenemy. The next day, after school, Lucy calls Mike to talk and decides to come clean. She tells him that Scott, the man who created those comic books, is her uncle. As a child, she became Scott's first comic book reader, but when her father discovered that she spent most of her time reading comic books, he decided to forbid her from seeing her uncle. The man wanted Lucy to focus her attention on her studies, because he wasn't going to risk her becoming a failure like Scott. Since then, the young woman has never seen him again, but 2 months ago she received a letter from her uncle. In it, Scott said that Lucy was the only person he could trust and asked the young woman to take care of the comics he had written, as they couldn't fall into the wrong hands. However, when she arrived at her uncle's old apartment, she realized that all the comics had disappeared. The only one left was the Great Finger comic book, and, from that day on, Lucy began her mission to gather all the comics back together again, as she believes this is the only way to find her uncle. When the young woman has finished telling her story, Nick appears and reveals that he was hiding to listen to the conversation. After discovering that Lucy is the masked vigilante, he shows her a video circulating on the internet, in which reporters report that San Francisco is under attack. The truth is that Dirk joined a group of rebels and shared his new comics so that, together, they could take over the city. That night, the team begins a brutal battle against dozens of police officers and enlists the help of the superheroes from their comics to defeat them. During the fight, Tara shows up to do some filming and the townspeople are left with their hands tied as no one is able to defeat the comic book gang. On arriving at the scene, Mike and his friends help the injured to their feet and do their best to prevent further casualties. Taking advantage of all the visibility he's getting thanks to the reporters everywhere, Dirk picks up the megaphone and decides to make a speech. The man calls himself the leader of a gang called the Comics Council and summons all nerds to join him, because he wants to use the mystical powers of comic books to create a revolution. In order to protect Mike and prevent him from being hurt, Crying Man attacks the Ginseng Man, but ends up being captured by him. While trying to defeat the enemy with his tsunami of tears, the superhero realizes that the plant gets even stronger in the presence of water, so X orders Lucky to go and help him. During the duel, they both work together to stop their enemies, but Crying Man ends up being electrocuted when he tries to defeat Sparkules with his tears. While recording the fight, Nick is almost hit by a vehicle, but luckily Tara manages to get there in time to save him and is surprised to see her son's best friend at a crime scene. After helping the young man up, the woman tries to get him to safety and Mike is shocked to see his mother running through the streets in the crossfire. Just then, one of the rebels summons the Locust to attack Lucky, but the two youngsters end up being hit as well. When she sees Mike lying unconscious, Lucy walks towards him and helps him up, but Dirk sends his entities to eliminate them once and for all and the girl calls Gravity to stop them. While the superhero holds off his enemies with his infinity drill, Sylph traps them all inside a tornado and in this way the pair manage to defeat all their opponents at once. Seeing all his gang members unconscious, Dirk is furious and tries one last attack. After gathering a pile of vehicles full of fuel, the man orders Sparkules to use his lightning to cause a huge explosion capable of destroying the entire city. However, to prevent this catastrophe from happening, Mike uses the power of his mind to summon all his heroes at the same time. Together, the entities combine their superpowers to send the vehicles into the sky and the explosion takes place far away from San Francisco. At the end of the battle, Mike collapses and all the townspeople come to regard him as a great hero. When he learns that Dirk has been defeated, Scott, Lucy's uncle, feels happy, as the man was just a pawn used to ensure that his evil plan of domination comes to fruition.